Hi there folks, in today's demonstration I'm going to show you how I built myself a virtual travel agent. Now the reason behind this was I was using Copilot, I was searching for a holiday, it wasn't able to give me real-time flight prices, so I thought to myself, could I use GPT in the form of Azure OpenAI but also AI Builder to generate myself some flight times and prices, but also give myself a detailed agenda. So the idea is simple. I send an email with my request to an email address, my Power Automate flow picks it up, it churns it out, and before I know it, I've got my personalized response back to my email in a matter of minutes. Now, as per usual, I'm going to demo this, but I'm also going to show you how I build it. If that's something that interests you, please make sure you like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's jump into the demonstration. So I'm going to kick things off from Power Automate with a demo first up. Ultimately, what I want to do is to send an email with a request for a holiday, and then using various API calls, the Azure OpenAI and also AI Builder, generate a friendly response from our travel agent with both an agenda but also a live flight price based on the request that we've passed via email. Now the reason this came about is because just recently I was using Copilot and I thought I would ask it the question about a holiday request. I've made up a make-believe one here about visiting Orlando with my family for 2 weeks, flying out on the 13th of July and returning via Paris. So when I send this off to Copilot, we can see what sort of response we get back, but meanwhile I'm going to put my flow into test mode and fire off an email to trigger the flow that I've built that will do the same thing. So if I bring up the email, you can see I've got exactly the same request from Aberdeen. I want to visit Orlando with the wife and kids, and we want 2 weeks, flying out on the 13th of July, returning via Paris so that we can sample the sites for 3 days, and I'll hit send. So as we take a look at the response on the right hand side, Copilot has given me a flight price for the 5th of March. That's despite me saying the 13th of July. We have been given some flight prices, and if I go and click on one of those links, for instance, we can see it takes us to Skyscanner. But unfortunately, the link that it's taking me to is just a generic page about Aberdeen to Orlando. If I have a look at the other links that we've got here, it does look like we might have one for flights. If I click on it and we can let it open, we have got some flights and some prices, but if I then go and have a look at the dates, it's the 1st of March to the 4th of March, and whilst it's an Aberdeen to Orlando return, it's only for one passenger. So back over on Power Automate, we can see that my flow is underway. It's generated a body based on this HTTP request, which is using GPT-4 on Azure OpenAI. And then it's using a developer API that sits with Skyscanner, allowing me to both create a search for flights, but also then poll for those results. Now this particular API is quite unreliable. It has just a single API key. It is public. It is purely for development, so there is a delay at this point, and I do have a retry set up on this API just in order for me to get results back. But in an ideal world, if I had a registration as an affiliate, I hopefully wouldn't be hitting these restrictions on the API endpoint. So with the flow run successfully, I should expect an email any second right now. And there we have it, my flight is going to cost $4,973. I have a lovely summary here from my travel agent about the fact that I want to visit Orlando with the wife and kids, looking for a 2-week trip, but also some details about the temperature and places I might want to go and visit. But the thing that I really want to call out now is this link here, which will give us our live flight prices based on my original request, which is to travel on July the 13th from Aberdeen to Orlando and to return via Paris. And if I click on that link, we can see that schedule here and our price, and hopefully shortly it will load up the full link, which would allow me, in theory, to book those flights right here, right now. And we can see the schedule. We've got Aberdeen to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to New York, New York to Orlando. Maybe not the most ideal route, but it's definitely got the spec there from Aberdeen through to Orlando on the 13th. I said for about 2 weeks, so it's asking me to return on the 27th, which is indeed 2 weeks, but it is going via Paris. I asked to stay in Paris for 3 days, so Sunday, Monday, Tuesday is technically 3 days, and then we fly from Paris all the way back to Aberdeen via Amsterdam. And if we remind ourselves, we can see the original request here, followed by the fully automated response, which includes that agenda and the flight price for the exact flight details that I've requested via the original email. So it's now time to go and explore the Power Automate flow and see how I brought together both Azure OpenAI and also AI Builder. So back in Power Automate, if we have a look at the history of the flow, it's all based on that trigger when an email comes in, and then I've broken the flow up into 3 separate scopes. The first scope is all about generating a prompt, and in that prompt I have some sample JSON, which is the body I need to send to a Skyscanner API. Now, to make life a bit easier, I'm bringing up that on screen now, and you can see this is the exact prompt that I'm using. There's a section in the prompt which is a user request, which is encapsulated in quotes, which includes some HTML as well as the original request that we can see from Aberdeen, I'd like to travel, etc. I could have cleaned that up and probably saved myself some tokens if I'd used the HTML to text action in Power Automate, but then I have the instructions to update the queries legs array based on the user's flight details, adjusting the IATA codes and the date, etc., assuming it's 2024 if not specified, and turning the children as ages into a pipe delimited string. So these are all part of the request body, and ChatGPT seems to handle it very well based on the requests that I'm sending in via email. Back into our flow, if I pop open this HTTP action, all that I'm doing is sending the API key, which is hidden, to this API endpoint on Azure, and in the body you can see that sample JSON that's been generated in the form of the content. And it's probably easier for us actually to go and jump across onto the AI Studio to have a look at how this actually works behind the scenes. So on the Azure OpenAI Studio, I have a couple of different deployments. I've got GPT-4 and GPT-4 1106. And the reason I've got 1106 is because it actually allows you to send a parameter across to specify that the output from your API call is purely JSON, which is extremely useful for this particular scenario. Now, if I paste in the prompt that I generated, we can see here the prompt including the instructions and the original email. If I send that across, we should see that appear here in the chat log, and then hopefully unfold, we should get a sample JSON body. So we can see our bot here generating a JSON body, which includes those IATA codes, Aberdeen to MCO, which is Orlando, the dates I was looking to travel, again Orlando to Charles de Gaulle in Paris, and then Charles de Gaulle through to Aberdeen. So based on that single instruction that I've sent via email, our GPT model has recognized that, extracted it, interpreted the dates, the periods, and also the fact that I'm wanting to stay 3 days in Paris, to then set up a flight for 2 adults and 3 children with those ages in pipe delimited strings. And it's by calling this API from Power Automate that I'm able to get that JSON body response. If we look at the second scope, which is all about the flight request to the Skyscanner API, we first of all have to go and do a flight search, and we create that request and we send across the body, and you can see the body there that includes those dates and those different airports, all generated via our ChatGPT model. There is then a delay of 30 seconds because those flight requests are all generated and could potentially take longer, but I went with 30 seconds. I could have looped, but again, I went with 30 seconds for the demo. And then I go and get those responses. So it's a second API call that uses a session ID, and based on that session ID, we can then get the particular flight responses back. Now, if I open that up, it's actually quite a chunky response. There are a lot of flight prices, a lot of deep links, but again, for the purpose of my demonstration, I've purely got the first response and returned that into my email. Next up, because of the complexity of the array that's returned, I do convert the data into XML. It makes my life easier in order to go and select the top price, and with that I'm then able to get the price out and also the deep link. You might notice that the price is slightly different. It's because I had to rerun it as I lost the flow history. And then I'm using the AI Builder, and the reason I'm using AI Builder with a GPT prompt is because GPT in AI Builder is very good at creating text. But ultimately, because I wanted my solution to create me an agenda for the holiday, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to use AI Builder. So if I fire up the AI prompts, you can see I have a travel agent prompt. And if I click on that, it's all based on acting as a friendly, professional, helpful travel agent, summarizing the weather at the time of year, as well as recommending some local attractions to visit whilst on holiday. And you'll see that there's a parameter, and that's based on the customer request. And within Power Automate and also in Power Apps, what this translates into is a parameter, and therefore I can pass anything that's dynamic. So in my case, I'm actually passing across the body of the email, and that's ultimately what allows me to provide that personalized response in the email that's generated. So with all that information, all we're doing is then just sending ourselves a response back with the flight details and the summarized agenda, and then finally at the very bottom we include a link back into that flight price that has been generated via the Skyscanner API. Now the Skyscanner API is public, you can use it. It is a developer API. I've mentioned already that it can be a bit unreliable because everyone is using it. Everyone uses the same API key, but it's a very good opportunity to experiment with both GPT models in AI Builder and also Azure OpenAI, as well as bringing an API into Power Automate. So if I now pop open the flow in edit mode, we can see that I have the trigger when a new email arrives, and the only exception here to the parameters is the subject filter. I've put in place a filter on the subject where it's equal to flight request, and that was ultimately just to prevent it triggering on every single email that came into my mailbox. Then within the first scope, it's all about creating the JSON body. I have the prompt in a compose here, which is basically the sample JSON body with the prompt text. And it has a dynamic value here, which is based on the body of the trigger, i.e. the body of the received email. Then I've got my API key, which is secret, followed by an HTTP request. And that HTTP request is to my endpoint in Azure. I do a post. I have my API key that's passed, and then you'll see the formation of the body, which includes the outputs from the compose prompt above, which is the prompt, of course. And the other thing to call out is this parameter here called response format. We have a type of JSON object, and what that means is that the response that comes back from the model will be strictly JSON. And in order to use that, you need to make sure that you are on GPT-4 11.06 and also currently on the 1st of July 23 preview. The obvious advantage of using this is that you guarantee that your output is in JSON, which really lends itself to the next part of the flow. Now, as I move further down my flow, we can have a look at the scope that involves the request to Skyscanner. We've got the endpoint here to create our search. You can see the API key, which, like I say, is public. Everyone uses the same API key. And then I have a body, which is based on an expression. We're getting the first choices from our HTTP response and then returning the message content. And we use the JSON expression to ensure that the stringified response is turned into JSON, and that allows us to ultimately use that dynamic body that's been generated by the HTTP request above. I've then got a simple delay of 30 seconds, and then I go ahead and poll the results, and it's here that I pull out the session token from the HTTP request above. That's needed as part of that HTTP request. As we scroll back down through the flow, we can then look at the scope that gets the first price and the first deep link. I have a compose here that targets the itineraries object that's part of the response, and then turn it into a JSON object with a route. So using that compose itineraries here in this object. Now, the reason I do that is because it then allows me to turn it into XML with the following expression. And with XML, because of the complexity of the data that's returned, in fact, if I jump back onto the history here, we can see that we have the itineraries object, and each object has a key based on the legs. So there are individual GUIDs here that are generated for the legs, but of course I don't know what those GUIDs are. So it makes it very difficult for me to retrieve data back from this data structure. So by turning it into XML, it allows me to return the first or do searches. I have videos on using XML. I suggest you go and watch one of those videos and learn some of those techniques if none of this is making sense. So by converting into XML, we can now use XPath, and with XPath you can see I have an expression here that is allowing me to get the first pricing option, the first price within that, and the first amount within that structure, and then returning again the first value as text. So ultimately I'm able to get the first price that comes back from the response, and it was purely so that I had a price available for the email. If I really wanted to, I could have returned all of it, I could have filtered it, I could have ordered it, etc. to get all those prices as required for a summary. And if I have a look at the deep link, very similar. I'm using XPath, and rather than returning the price, I'm returning the first deep link. So with all that in place in Compose Actions, I'm then ready to create my email, but just before I do that, I have create text with GPT using a prompt, and that's where I have that pre-built prompt called the travel agent. And because I added a customer request parameter, I'm able to again pass in that body, which is the email body from the trigger. And with that body, the travel agent is able to create me a bespoke agenda with advice on the weather forecast and various attractions. So the only thing left is the send an email action. Of course, the from is based on who has sent me the email. The flight includes a calculation on the price, which is a conversion of the compose, which is an array, hence why you see 0, that returns the first integer index. I convert that into an integer using the int expression, and then I'm dividing it by 1,000 because for whatever reason their API returns the value as a multiple of 1,000. So of course I need to divide by 1,000 to get the price including pence. Then I'm passing the text response from my AI builder prompt, and then I have a little bit of text followed by the price once more, and then a link to that dynamic deep link that I've retrieved in the compose above. So that marks the end of the demo. I've shown you end to end how you can build your own travel agent using Power Automate, the Azure OpenAI technologies, AI Builder, and also the Skyscanner Flight API. As always, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something. Let me know in the comments, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.